Another slowly lowered her phone. The room seemed to forget that. Cameras were rolling. A producer removed his headset and stared at the stage. Victoria stood calmly. Her hands folded in front of her. She did not look angry. That somehow made the sentence feel heavier. An older reporter finally cleared his throat. Mrs. Reynolds. Are you asking for criminal charges? She looked at him. I'm asking people to remember that my daughter is 8 years old. The man lowered his eyes. Another voice came from the back. What do you want to happen now? Victoria took a slow breath. Want the next little girl to walk onto a plane and never wonder if she belongs there? No one spoke. A young journalist wiped his face. With his sleeve, he had spent the entire morning preparing difficult questions. Suddenly, none of them seemed important. The silence continued. Then, a woman near the front whispered, almost to herself. That's all she wanted. Several heads turned toward her. Victoria heard the words and nodded once. Yes, she said softly. That's all she wanted. Pens remained still. Laptops stayed open, but untouched, for the first time since the story broke. The room was not thinking about lawsuits or stock prices. They were thinking about a little girl carrying a sketchbook and a boarding pass. They were thinking about trust. They were thinking about how easily dignity could be taken away. Victoria stepped away from the podium. Nobody called after her. Nobody shouted another question as she walked toward the hospital doors. The entire room remained seated, carrying the weight of a sentence that felt less like an accusation and more like a truth. No one could ignore anymore. Victoria disappeared through the hospital doors. But nobody in the room moved to follow her. The reporters remained seated. A camera operator slowly lowered his equipment. For several long moments, there were no questions. The silence felt different now. An older journalist finally spoke. Though it sounded more like a confession. My daughter is 10. Number 1 answered him. He looked down at his notes. Keep thinking about that little girl standing in line. A producer beside him nodded quietly. Another reporter closed her laptop. This isn't really about the arm anymore, is it? The question drifted through the room. Nobody rushed to answer because everyone already knew. A young woman near the back finally spoke. It's about the first time a child realizes the world sees her differently. The room became still again. Someone exhaled slowly. A television correspondent removed the microphone clipped to his jacket. I've covered disasters and elections, he said softly. I don't remember the last time a sentence made a room go this quiet. Oh, no one disagreed. They were no longer thinking about lawsuits. They were thinking about children, about assumptions, about how quickly a stranger could decide who belonged and who did. Not one reporter stared at the hospital doors. She carried a valid ticket the entire time. Another nodded and still had to prove herself. The words settled heavily. A woman who had spent the day preparing aggressive questions closed her notebook. Don't think that story is an airline anymore, she said. What is it then? Someone asked. She looked around the room. It's every place where people have to earn dignity that should already be theirs. Well, no one wrote that sentence down. They simply sat with it. Outside, news vans continued broadcasting updates. Inside, the conversation had quietly changed. A broken arm had opened a much larger wound. And everyone in the room suddenly understood that the hardest injuries to heal are often the ones people cannot see at all. The room remained quiet until the hospital doors opened again. Victoria stepped back toward the microphones. Nobody pushed forward this time. Nobody shouted questions. A reporter asked gently, "How is your daughter?" Victoria nodded once. She's resting. Then she looked at the cameras. People keep asking me what should happen next, her voice was calm. They ask about punishment and lawsuits and consequences. I folded her hands together. Those things matter. Accountability matters. She paused. But that's not what keeps me awake. Tonight, the room became still again. Daughter's arm will heal. Several reporters glanced at one another. The cast will come off. The pain will fade. She swallowed. Carefully. What scares me is something I can't see. No camera. Moved. I keep wondering when she asked me why it happened. A long silence followed. I keep wondering if she'll stand at another gate someday and hesitate. Her voice softened. She'll look around a room and ask herself whether she really belongs there. A reporter lowered his eyes. Victoria continued. Every parent wants their child to walk into the world with confidence. She took a slow breath. It spent years teaching my daughter that no dream was too big and no place was beyond her reach. The lights from the cameras reflected in her eyes, and it took one moment, one stranger, to make that lesson feel fragile. Nobody wrote anything. Learn quickly, she said softly. Sometimes they learn kindness. Sometimes they learn fear. She looked toward the hospital again. My greatest fear is not that my daughter remembers the pain. Her voice almost broke. My fear is that she remembers the doubt. The words settled over the crowd because everyone there suddenly understood that broken bones could heal. But the moment a child begins questioning her worth can remain long after every cast has disappeared and every headline has faded from memory. Forever. For several seconds after Victoria finished speaking, nobody asked another question. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt human. A reporter in the front row unlocked his phone and stared at the picture on his screen. A little boy, wearing a baseball cap, smiled back at him. He quickly turned the phone over beside him. A woman opened her gallery and looked at a photograph of her daughter holding a backpack on her first day of school. She swallowed hard. The room had changed. This was no longer a press conference. It felt like a gathering of parents who had suddenly imagined their own children standing at gate 17. A cameraman quietly wiped his eyes. No one teased him. A young journalist finally raised his hand. His voice sounded different now. Mrs. Reynolds, what do you say to children who have felt this way before? Victoria looked at him carefully. Before answering, she noticed the framed photograph sticking out of his notebook. Two little girls smiled at the camera. She understood the question immediately. I tell them, she said softly, that other people's assumptions do not decide their worth. The young man nodded without writing anything. Another reporter spoke. I have a son, she said quietly. I keep thinking about him hearing those words. Nobody looked at her. Strangely, several people nodded. Victoria took a slow breath. That's why I'm speaking. Carefully, she looked around the room. Anger fades. Headlines disappear. But children remember how adults make them feel. The statement settled heavily. The woman with the photograph of her daughter slowly closed her phone. A producer removed his earpiece. Nobody seemed interested in breaking news anymore. They were listening differently now, not as journalists, not as professionals, but as mothers and fathers imagining their own children carrying a boarding pass and a dream, only to have a stranger question whether they belonged there at all in the first place. The room remained quiet, and Victoria seemed to understand that everyone was listening differently now. She stepped a little closer to the microphones. I need to say something important. Several reporters looked up. Is story is not about one woman. A few people exchanged glances. One person made a terrible decision. And accountability matters. It absolutely matters. She paused. But if we stop there, then we learn nothing. No keyboards moved. No child gets hurt like this because of one moment alone. Her voice stayed steady. These things survive because of habits, because of assumptions, because too many people see warning signs and decide they are someone else's problem. Reporter slowly lowered his pen. Victoria continued. There were people who complained before my daughter. There were employees who spoke up before yesterday. Nobody interrupted. Somehow the system kept moving. The words settled. Over the crowd, she looked from face to face. If all we do is blame one person and move on, then another child will stand in another line somewhere and hear the same message, young journalist whispered. She's right. No one disagreed. Victoria folded her hands. I'm not asking for revenge. The room grew even quieter. I'm asking for honesty. Took a slow breath. I'm asking people to look at the things we ignore because they feel uncomfortable. A producer stopped taking notes. I'm asking institutions to listen the first time someone says, this doesn't feel right. The cameras continued recording. Because silence can become permission. The sentence seemed to land on everyone at once. An older reporter nodded slowly. For the first time that day, the story felt larger than an airport, larger than an airline, even larger than one injured child. It was about the small decisions people make every day. The decisions to question, to dismiss, to stay quiet, or to speak. And everyone in the room suddenly understood that Victoria was not asking for someone to fall. She was asking for something much harder. She was asking people to change. Nobody stood when Victoria stepped away from the podium. She simply turned and walked toward the hospital doors again. The cameras followed her, but the reporters remained in their seats. No. One shouted another question. No one asked for a final statement. The silence itself had become the story. A producer looked at the breaking news banner on his screen and slowly removed it. The words suddenly felt too small. Across the room, a journalist closed her notebook without writing a final sentence. She already knew what she would tell her viewers. A little girl thought she belonged. Someone tried to teach her otherwise. An older reporter leaned back in his chair. I don't think this ends tonight, he said. Quietly, no, another answered. I think it starts tonight. Several heads nodded. The cameras were still recording. But nobody seemed interested in being first anymore. They were thinking about airports, schools, offices, in every place where people silently wondered whether they were welcome, one by one. The reporters began putting away their phones. No one rushed toward the exits. No. One wanted to break the silence. It felt disrespectful somehow, through the glass doors. Victoria disappeared down the corridor. A young journalist looked at the empty podium. She never raised her voice. He whispered. The woman beside him shook her head. She didn't have to. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then the room slowly emptied. Outside, the country waited for answers. Inside, a different question remained. Why had an 8-year-old girl needed a boarding pass and courage just to be treated like she belonged? Outside, a reporter saved the video, pictured his son boarding a plane someday, and realized that every child carries invisible questions adults should never place on their shoulders, and nobody reached for questions that night. The television interview ends, but the screen does not go dark. Another face appears. Then another. Jessica sits forward on the couch, the remote hanging loosely in her hand. A reporter said, "We've received hundreds of messages since this story broke. Photographs filled the screen. Different airports. Different years. Different people. A man spoke first. I was asked 3 times if I was sitting in the correct section. Then a woman appeared. They kept asking where my husband was, even though I paid for the tickets. Jessica swallowed hard. The stories kept coming. An elderly man said, I felt like I needed permission to be there. The anchor looked into the camera. These testimonies are revealing a pattern many passengers say existed for years. Jessica lowered her eyes. She remembered a young athlete she had once. Questioned, she remembered a businessman whose irritation had annoyed her. She remembered every time she had thought, just making sure. On television, a former employee spoke calmly. We all saw things that made us uncomfortable. Most of us stayed quiet, another added. The incidents seem small until you place them together. Jessica felt something inside her collapse. The stories sounded familiar because pieces of them belonged to her. No one was shouting. No one wanted revenge. A mother said softly. I just wanted my children to feel welcome, former passenger added. Being treated like you don't belong stays with you. Jessica covered her mouth. The anchor continued. Schools are discussing the incident. Companies are reviewing training policies. Community groups are holding conversations about bias. The story had moved far beyond Gate 17. It had moved beyond her. She looked at the television and whispered, I thought it was one mistake. The room remained silent. On the screen, Ava's smiling school photograph appeared. Again, Jessica stared at it. Then she turned the television off and sat alone in the dark. Realizing the country was not watching her fall, it was watching an entire system finally being seen. The television remained dark, but Jessica could still hear the words in her head. Leadership becomes responsible. The next morning, every network carried the same live broadcast. Executives sat in a room that looked exhausted. Reporters waited quietly. Nobody expected excuses anymore. Then Victoria stepped to the podium. I am speaking today as a mother, she said, and as someone responsible for making sure this never happens again. She announced that the entire crew involved at Gate 17 had been terminated. A murmur moved through the room and disappeared. Accountability cannot stop with one person, she continued. Several senior managers were placed under investigation. Independent reviewers would examine years of complaints and internal records. New reporting systems and mandatory training would begin immediately. Nobody applauded. Victoria looked across the room. Policies matter, she said softly. But policies cannot hold a child while she cries. Silence settled again. When prejudice becomes routine, leadership becomes responsible. Not a single reporter moved. Across the city, Jessica sat on her couch staring at the screen. She did not cry. She simply looked at her. Reflection in the dark television. The uniform was gone. The future she planned was gone. Yet another thought hurt more. Somewhere, a little girl would remember her face before remembering the flight. The broadcast ended quietly. People left the room carrying folders and unanswered feelings outside the building. Cameras remained pointed at the doors, but nobody chased statements. The story no longer needed words. The decisions had become the message. And that message carried a weight witnesses could feel. Victoria stepped away from the microphones and paused beside the doorway. Justice had not repaired a broken arm. It had done something else. It had forced an institution to promise that another child would never be taught the same cruel lesson. The promise had been made, and the world slowly moved forward without her. Jessica stepped outside her apartment, carrying a bag of groceries. Across the street, an elderly neighbor saw her and quietly went inside. She stopped walking. Only a week ago they had spoken. Every morning at the small cafe near the corner. She ordered coffee and sat beside the window. 2 women recognized her. Immediately, their conversation ended. One of them looked down at her cup. The other checked her phone. Nobody said a cruel word. Nobody had. 2. Jessica left the cafe with the coffee untouched. Back home, she unlocked her phone. No new messages. She opened an old group chat filled with jokes, birthday wishes, and photographs from layovers. The last message sent to her remained unanswered. Hope you're okay. It had been 5 days. She closed the screen and looked toward the bedroom. Uniforms still hung inside the closet. For a moment, she almost reached for it. Then she remembered there would never be another flight. She sat on the floor and opened an old photo album. Training pictures, holiday dinners, a photograph of her standing proudly beside her crew. She barely recognized the smiling woman. The apartment felt larger than before. The silence seemed to move from room to room. As evening arrived, another memory returned. A little girl reaching for a boarding pass. Scream, a broken arm. Jessica closed her eyes. The headlines were already fading from television. People were discussing other stories now, yet her world remained. Inside that airport, she picked up the photograph one last time, then placed it face down on the table. Nothing dramatic happened. She simply sat there, alone, while everything she had been continued becoming someone she no longer knew. Outside, darkness kept listening. Outside, darkness kept listening. Inside another home, morning sunlight rested across the kitchen table. Weeks had passed. Ava's cast had finally come off, and the doctor said her arm was healing perfectly. Still, Victoria noticed the quiet moments. Sometimes, her daughter stared through the window longer than before. Sometimes she stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. Recovery had returned ordinary routines to the house, but caution still lived there. Then, one morning, Victoria walked into the kitchen and stopped. Ava had opened her old box of crayons. Sheets of paper covered the table. "You feel like drawing again?" Victoria asked softly. Ava nodded without looking up. For the first time in weeks, Victoria smiled. She sat nearby and watched. An airplane slowly appeared on the page. Then, another. Clouds, windows, tiny passengers. There was no fear in the drawings, only bright colors. Over the next few days, the pictures kept coming. Each one seemed happier than the last. Then, one afternoon, Victoria noticed a new drawing. She picked it up carefully. Inside the airplane sat a little girl. Beside a large window, she held a sketchbook. She was smiling, and she was sitting in first class. Victoria looked at her daughter. "Is this you?" she asked. Ava nodded. "You look happy." "I am," Ava said simply. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. The child in the picture was not scared. She was not being questioned. She belonged there completely, without knowing it. Ava had drawn something much larger than an airplane. She had drawn herself, keeping her place in the world. Victoria sat beside her. "I love this picture." Ava grinned and carried it to the refrigerator. She placed it beside old-school drawings and ran toward the living room. Victoria remained standing in the kitchen. The picture was simple. Crayons, clouds, a smiling child. But to her, it looked like courage hanging on a refrigerator door. But to her, it looked like courage hanging on a refrigerator door across the city. Another kitchen table held something very different, a blank sheet of paper. Jessica sat alone before it. The television was off. The curtains were closed. Only the ticking of the clock filled the room. For days she had avoided this moment. Now the paper waited. She picked up the pen. "Dear Ava," she stopped. The words looked too small. She tried again. "I am sorry." Again, she paused. "Sorry for what? For the broken arm? For frightening a child? for making her question whether she belonged. The questions remained on the paper like shadows. Jessica rubbed her eyes. She looked around the apartment. There was nobody there to tell her what to write. No lawyer, no company statement, only her. She lowered the pen once more. Dear Ava, I think about you every day. She read the sentence twice. Then she continued. I wish I'd seen you as a little girl, instead of an assumption. Her hand trembled. The silence in the apartment seemed heavier. She remembered the child reaching for her boarding pass. She remembered the scream. She remembered a mother asking one simple question. Who touched my daughter? Jessica closed her eyes. The paper was slowly filling with words, but none of them felt enough. How could a letter carry the weight of that day? How could an apology repair a memory? She stared at the page for a long time. Then she placed the pen down. The letter remained unfinished. Not because she had nothing to say, because she finally understood. Something painful. Some harm cannot be measured by broken bones, and some apologies cannot ask to be forgiven. Jessica folded the paper once and left it on the table. She did not place it in an envelope. She did not write an address. She simply turned off the kitchen light and walked away. Leaving the letter exactly where it was, she pulled the paper closer and wrote, Dear Ava, I am sorry for hurting you. The sentence looked weak the moment she finished it. Jessica crossed it out. She tried again. I made a terrible mistake. That line lasted only a few seconds before another dark mark covered it. She leaned back and closed her eyes. Sorry, mistake, accident, every word sounded smaller than the memory sitting inside her. The apartment was silent except for the scratching of her pen. She wrote 3 more lines and tore the page from the notebook. Another page followed, then another. Nothing sounded honest enough. Nothing sounded big enough. Her hand finally stopped moving. Without warning, she heard the little girl's voice again. My arm, Mommy. Jessica's fingers tightened around the pen. She remembered the fear in that cry. She remembered Ava looking around for someone who could make the pain disappear. I want my mom, the child had said. Jessica covered her face. I know, she whispered into the empty room. Tears slid through her fingers. For weeks, she had been thinking about investigations, interviews, losing her job. Now none of that felt important. All she could see was a frightened child calling for her mother. She imagined the cast on Ava's arm and the drawing hanging in her kitchen. For the first time, she stopped searching for forgiveness and simply sat with the truth she had created all by herself tonight. She looked back at the unfinished letter. Then she slowly wrote one final sentence. I cannot give you back that day. She stared at the words for a long time. At last, she placed the pen beside the paper. The letter remained unfinished because she finally understood something painful. An apology could describe regret. It could never rewrite a memory. She pulled the unfinished letter closer and read the last sentence again. I cannot give you back that day. For the first time, she did not reach for the pen to fix it. Instead, she turned the page and began writing something different. Not an apology, not a defense, a question. Why did I look at you and decide you did not belong? The words made her stop breathing for a moment. She had spent weeks blaming stress, delays, and confusion. Now those excuses felt thin and empty. She wrote slowly. I think I was seeing something that was never there. Then another sentence. I think I carried assumptions without knowing how heavy they were. She stared at the page. The letter was changing. It was no longer asking for forgiveness. It was becoming a confession she had never made to anyone, including herself. The room remained silent as she continued. I hurt you because I never stopped to see you. The tears blurred the ink. She wiped her eyes and kept writing. Then her hand froze. A new sentence appeared on the paper. I never asked your name. She looked at those 5 words for a very long time. Nothing else on the page felt as honest. She remembered asking, about tickets? She remembered asking where the child's parents were. She remembered questioning, Everything except the little girl herself. "I never asked your name," she whispered. The sentence sat alone in the middle of the page, like an answer to every question. Everything that followed had started there. Not with the broken arm, not with the video, not with the headlines. It had begun with a child. It's becoming an assumption instead of a person. Jessica set the pen down, for the first time since Gate 17. She understood that the hardest truths were often the simplest ones. And this truth would stay with her long after the letter remained unfinished forever. Jessica kept staring at the folded pages resting on the table. For a moment, she imagined placing them inside an envelope. She imagined a mail carrier leaving it at Victoria's door. She imagined a mother opening it with tired hands. Then, she imagined a little girl seeing her own name, written by the woman who had hurt her. The thought made her chest tighten. What would that letter ask from them? Understanding? Forgiveness? Another moment of their attention? She suddenly realized she had no right to ask for any of those things. The pages in front of her felt heavier. A letter could not remove fear from a child's memory. It could not erase the sound of a scream in an airport terminal. It could not return a day that had been taken away. Regret had arrived. But it had arrived too late to change what happened. She slowly folded the paper. There was no signature at the bottom, no address on an envelope, no stamp. Waiting to be used, she opened the drawer beside the table and placed the pages inside. The drawer closed with a soft sound. For a long time, she sat there with her hand resting on the handle. Then she stood. The apartment was dark except for the lamp above the table. She turned it off. The room disappeared into shadow. But the letter remained in the drawer, hidden unsent. She finally understood that remorse and repair were not the same thing. Some damage could be acknowledged without being undone. Some apologies existed only because the person writing them needed to face the truth. Jessica walked quietly toward her bedroom. Behind her, the unfinished letter stayed exactly where it belonged. Not as forgiveness, not as redemption, but as the only honest record of a moment she would carry for the rest of her life. Months passed, and the airline looked different. On a quiet Monday morning, new employees entered a training room that had not existed the year before. They carried notebooks and coffee cups, expecting presentations about schedules, customer service, and emergency procedures. Instead, the first slide showed a photograph of Gate 17. The room became still. An instructor stood beside the screen. "Everything you will learn today exists because of one morning we failed a child." No company awards appeared on the screen. No statistics. No smiling advertisements. Only the image of the gate. The presentation began, step by step. The trainees learned what had happened. A little girl, a first-class ticket, an assumption, a broken arm. Nobody spoke while the old video played. A few employees shifted in their seats. Others watched without blinking. When the recording ended, the instructor looked around the room. What assumptions were made before any questions were asked? No one answered. The silence itself became part of the lesson. The instructor clicked to the next slide. New reporting systems appeared on the screen. Independent oversight committees. Mandatory training sessions. Policies matter, she said quietly. But rules alone cannot create dignity. Another slide appeared. The words were simple. Ask who someone is before deciding where they belong. One young employee copied the sentence into the margin of her notebook. She underlined it. Twice, the presentation continued. But the room had changed. This was no longer training. It felt like a responsibility. When the session finally ended, nobody stood immediately. The employees remained in their seats, carrying the weight of what they had seen at the front of the room. The final message stayed on the screen. Every passenger deserves dignity before judgment. The lights brightened. Still, nobody spoke, because everyone understood that one child's pain had become a warning meant for every person who came after her. The training room eventually emptied. But its lessons remained. Months later, another airport morning arrived. Sunlight spilled through the terminal windows as rolling suitcases moved across the floor. Boarding announcements echoed overhead. Ava stood beside her mother, holding a boarding pass in one hand and a small sketchbook in the other. The airport looked ordinary, yet it felt different. She stared toward the gate and became quiet. Her fingers tightened around the ticket. For a moment, another morning returned to her. Another gate, another crowd, another painful memory, Victoria noticed. Immediately, she knelt beside her daughter. "You okay, sweetheart?" Ava looked at the plane. Then she whispered, "Do I belong here?" The question seemed to stop the world for a second. Victoria smiled softly. She took her daughter's hand. "You belong anywhere your dreams take you." Ava looked at her mother. The words settled gently inside her. She turned back toward the gate. The fear was still there. Small and distant, but something stronger stood beside it now. Courage. She took a slow breath. Then her small fingers wrapped around her mother's hand. Together, they started walking. No cameras followed them. No one in the terminal knew their story. They were simply a mother and daughter heading toward a flight. The boarding doors opened. Dada stepped forward. Something inside her opened too. The airport no longer felt like the place where she had been hurt. It became a place she had chosen to return to. Some wounds heal, others remain as quiet reminders, but neither kind of wound gets to decide who a person becomes at the entrance to the plane. Ava looked up and smiled. Then she walked inside. The gate closed behind them, and somewhere in that ordinary morning lived an extraordinary truth. Sometimes the smallest voice changes an entire system simply by refusing to disappear forever.